The great hall of Zarenthia shimmered with crystal walls and columns that pulsed softly with the Empire's living energy as hundreds of nobles and soldiers filled the air with whispers, sharp glances, and mocking laughter aimed at the lone human standing beneath the throne. Commander Elias Rourke looked completely out of place in his dull gray Earth uniform. No armor, no weapon in sight, just a calm expression and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. Across from him, Queen Exalvora sat tall on her throne, her long golden headdress gleaming like a sunlit blade, her expression one of cold amusement. She was known throughout the galaxy as both a ruler and a warrior, feared for her ruthless efficiency and pride in her species' dominance. Humanity, a recent arrival to the interstellar stage, was barely considered intelligent by Zarenthian standards, let alone worthy of standing in the royal court. Yet here was this man, this Earth envoy, requesting equal trade rights, peace treaties, and perhaps the greatest insult, mutual respect. Zalvora's fingers tapped once on the throne's arm, and the room silenced. She rose slowly, her tall form elegant and dangerous, and then with a smile as sharp as a blade, she called for her champion, General Varkas. The crowd erupted into cheers and stomping as the doors slammed open and Varkas stepped in, a towering figure, armored in obsidian plates edged with red, his eyes glowing faintly from the enhancements within. He had won every duel fought in the name of the Queen, crushing enemies from distant worlds, humiliating ambassadors, and destroying the pride of rival empires. Now he stood before the human with a slight tilt of his head, as if trying to understand why this fragile creature hadn't already fled. "You insult the Queen by standing here," he said, his voice deep like distant thunder. "But she is merciful. You will be allowed to leave after I shatter your pride." The hall roared with approval, but Rourke didn't flinch. Instead, he raised one hand slowly and spoke in a firm but respectful tone, reminding them of the ancient Zarenthian code of honor that allowed a diplomatic duel, not just a fight, but a legally binding challenge. The court murmured. Few remembered that rule, fewer still had seen it invoked. The Queen's eyes narrowed. It was a bold move and a dangerous one. But once spoken, the law held power. She could not refuse without shaming her throne. And so the arena was prepared. It was a large circular platform of smooth black stone, surrounded by floating spectators and recording drones. The duel was not meant to kill, but to defeat physically or mentally. Varkas entered with a massive war staff humming with plasma, spinning at once with ease. Rourke, by contrast, wore a light exosuit beneath his uniform Earth tech, barely understood by Zarenthians, and carried nothing more than a compact wrist-mounted shield and a pair of strange curved blades no longer than his forearms. No one expected the human to last more than a few minutes. The Queen sat high above, lips pressed in a straight line, already preparing her speech for afterward. But something changed the moment the gong echoed through the arena and the fight began. Rourke didn't charge or shout. He moved sideways in a tight circle, watching Varkas's stance, waiting. The general, perhaps annoyed by the lack of fear, came in fast, swinging the war staff with brutal strength. But Rourke ducked, sidestepped, and struck a light tap behind the knee, nothing damaging, but enough to make the crowd blink. He was fast. Not strong like Varkas, not armored like the elite, but fast, clever, and entirely calm. The duel continued, with Varkas growing more frustrated. And Rourke danced around him like smoke, cutting where it counted, small strikes to weaken balance, fast jabs to trigger sensors, calculated feints that left the general swinging at air. The crowd stopped cheering. They leaned forward. Even the Queen was watching now, with more interest than contempt. This was not just a man trying to survive, this was someone trained to win. Then it happened. Varkas lunged, roaring, putting all his power into one final charge meant to end the duel. But Rourke ducked beneath the staff, twisted, and drove both blades into the power pack on the general's back, non-lethal, but enough to disable his armor. Sparks flew. The mighty Varkas stumbled forward, landed hard on his knees, and fell. The silence that followed was louder than any cheer. The Queen stood slowly, her expression unreadable, while Rourke stepped back, breathing only slightly heavier, and looked up toward her throne. "By the laws of your court," he said clearly. "I claim victory, and with it, the boon promised by your challenge." Her fingers curled around the edge of her throne. She could deny him, but to do so would be to break her own law in front of her people. Her pride warred with her duty. Then, in a voice quiet but echoing with ancient power, she spoke the words that would change both their futures. "Then you shall have it. By our customs, I am your reward." Gasps rippled through the court like a physical wave. Rourke said nothing, but his eyes locked with hers, not with arrogance, but with steady certainty. He had not come to conquer nor to shame. He had come to show them that humans were not weak. That respect was not taken by force, but earned through strength, discipline, and honor. And now, by their own rules, the Queen of Zarenthia had bound herself to him not just by name, but by the ancient law of alliance through ritual duel. Whatever came next, one thing was clear: humanity had just made its mark, and the galaxy would never look at Earth the same way again. The entire court stood frozen in disbelief, eyes flicking between the fallen General Varkas and the quiet, composed human who had brought him down. Commander Elias Rourke didn't raise his arms in victory, or boast. He simply took a calm breath, as if the duel had been a necessary task rather than a triumph. Queen Exilvora remained on her throne, unmoving, though the tension in her jaw betrayed her inner storm. Her most trusted warrior, the undefeated symbol of Zyrenthian pride, lay disarmed and unconscious at her feet, and by the sacred law she had invoked to humiliate the human, she was now bound to him in a way none could have expected. Whispers filled the air like the rustling of dry leaves before a storm. High nobles exchanged glances, unsure if this was the beginning of reform or the first crack in the throne. The queen descended the steps slowly, her golden headdress shimmering with every step, and the crowd instinctively parted. Rourke stood still, watching her without fear. She stopped just inches away, her tall frame towering over him, her voice cool and clipped as she said, "You won the duel, human. What is it you truly want from me?" There was no trace of weakness in her voice, only challenge. Rourke answered without flinching, his words clear and deliberate. "I came for peace, not power. But your law demands the reward. I won't dishonor it. I ask only what your code grants a formal bond. Not as conqueror or master, but as your equal." The queen's eyes narrowed, as if trying to read something deeper in his expression. She had expected pride or greed, some kind of demand to humiliate her in turn. But Rourke's eyes held neither arrogance nor pity. Just a steady calm, as if he understood exactly what kind of fire he had walked into and still chose to remain. She gave a single nod, tight and formal, then turned away. "Prepare the rite," she commanded, and her court fell into a whirlwind of activity. That night, the ritual was held not a celebration, but a binding, a ceremonial contract of unity drawn from Zarenthian law. Rourke stood beside the queen on the ritual platform, draped in a dark, formal robe stitched with glowing silver veins, as tradition dictated. The queen's voice carried across the hall as she spoke the ancient vows, though there was steel in her tone. The final lines sealed their bond in the eyes of the people, the court, and the galaxy. They were now united. Not just politically, but symbolically. A warrior queen and a human who had bested her champion, now tied together by honor. But not everyone celebrated. Deep beneath the palace, whispers turned to plotting. In the chambers of the disgraced Varkas, now recovering under heavy guard, a group of military advisors and noble sympathizers gathered in secret. They saw the queen's forced union not as honor, but humiliation, a stain on Zarenthian pride. And they would not let it stand. Varkas, bruised but alive, opened his eyes with a single word on his lips: war. Meanwhile, above in the royal tower, Rourke sat at a small desk, studying ancient Zarenthian scrolls on custom, law, and diplomacy. He had expected resistance, but not silence. Salvora had barely spoken since the rite. She was avoiding him, or perhaps testing him. When she finally entered the chamber, her steps were soundless, her expression unreadable. "You understand what you've done, don't you?" she said without preamble. Rourke looked up calmly. "Yes. I gave you a chance to keep your law without losing your dignity. and I showed your court that humanity is not here to bow or to conquer, just to be heard." The queen stared at him, a mix of frustration and reluctant respect brewing beneath the surface. She had spent her life fighting wars, enforcing control, building her empire through fear and strength, and now one human with quick hands and steady words had shaken the very foundation of that power. Days passed and whispers turned to rumors. Dissent stirred through the ranks of the military, nobles questioned the queen's decisions, and old rival states began to circle like vultures, sensing weakness. But the queen did not falter. If anything, she grew more commanding, more active, and more unpredictable. And to the surprise of many, Rourke remained beside her not as a puppet, but as a quiet advisor. He spoke rarely, but when he did, people listened. Slowly, some of the younger warriors began to admire him, drawn to his calm logic and adaptable thinking. The queen watched this shift with silent fascination. She had meant to break the human and prove her people's strength. Instead, he had become a symbol of something more dangerous, respect earned through understanding, not fear. Then one evening, the queen summoned Rourke to the training grounds. She tossed him a practice blade and motioned for him to spar. It was not a challenge, but a question. He accepted. The duel was fast, fierce, but playful testing, learning. As their blades crossed, something changed. They weren't enemies. Not anymore. They were warriors from two worlds, forced into unity by law, but growing closer by choice. Still, danger loomed on the horizon. In the shadows, Varkas had vanished, escaped his guards, and taken loyal soldiers with him. Rumors spoke of a growing rebellion, a movement to overthrow the queen and cleanse Zarenthia of human influence. And as the queen and Rourke stood in the quiet of the palace balcony, watching the twin moons rise, she finally spoke the words that had hung between them since the moment he won the duel. "You were never meant to win," she said. "But you did. And now we both must live with what that means." Rourke nodded, not with regret, but with resolve. "Then let's make it mean something." Far beyond the palace, a storm was rising. And at its center, a fallen warrior planned his revenge not just against the human who defeated him, but against the queen who dared to change. The days that followed were heavy with tension, like the air before a thunderstorm, and though Queen Exalvora remained calm in front of her court, she could feel the walls of loyalty shifting around her. Whispers of rebellion were no longer quiet, and too many of her advisors had begun asking careful questions they never would have dared before. Some said her bond to the human was a crack in the throne, others feared she had grown weak. But the truth that bothered her most was far more personal. She had underestimated Elias Rourke, and now she was no longer sure if that mistake was her downfall or her salvation. She watched him closely from across meeting chambers and strategy halls, noting how he listened more than he spoke, how he moved without fear, but never pushed his presence. The nobles expected him to demand power, to use the bond for his gain, but instead, he offered insights, small suggestions that fixed long-standing issues her generals ignored, subtle strategies that made supply chains move faster, peace discussions with nearby neutral systems that actually succeeded, where her diplomats had failed. The more he stayed in her court, the more she saw him not as a prize taken by ritual, but as a force she could neither control nor dismiss. And that was what unsettled her most. Despite everything, the queen remained distant in public. She sat beside Rourke at formal events, but rarely spoke directly to him, unless protocol required it. In private, her coldness was less certain, and her silence seemed less like rejection and more like calculation. For Rourke, it was clear he was not truly welcome, even if he was respected. He did not try to win hearts with charm or clever words. He stayed focused, studied her people, learned their customs, and waited. Yet even his patience could not mask the truth that something darker was moving beneath the surface. Late one night, while walking through a lesser-used corridor in the palace, Rourke noticed the flicker of movement shadows that didn't belong. Moments later, 3 masked figures lunged from the dark. He reacted instantly, dropping one with a strike to the throat, disabling another with a blade to the leg, and pinning the third before they could escape. It wasn't a robbery. These were trained assassins, and their weapons carried symbols of an old noble house thought loyal to the queen. When her guards arrived and dragged the would-be killers away, Exalvora herself appeared minutes later, her expression hard as stone. She said nothing as she examined the scene, but the tightness in her shoulders and the flash in her eyes said more than words ever could. That night, for the first time since the bond, she summoned Rourke to her private war chamber. No guards, no advisors. Just her and him, facing the truth. "They were sent for you," she said quietly, looking over a flickering star map. "But the message was for me." Rourke stood still, waiting. "They want to scare me," she continued. "Make me break the bond, break the law, give them an excuse to start a war from the inside." She turned to him then, her eyes sharp and unflinching. "I won't give them that. And neither will you." Rourke nodded, calm as always. "Then we stand together." For the first time, she didn't correct him. In the following days, things changed. Quietly, slowly, but noticeably. The Queen began speaking to Rourke more in public, inviting him into military discussions, asking for his opinion in court without hesitation. Some nobles scoffed, others watched with newfound interest. Meanwhile, Rourke worked carefully, reaching out to members of the court who still held moderate views, building quiet alliances, and strengthening the political walls that had begun to crack. The Queen saw all of it. She saw how easily he could have taken control and how carefully he avoided it. Then came the news that confirmed what they had both feared. Varkas was alive, and he was no longer hiding. A Zarenthian outpost on the edge of the Empire had gone silent, its entire command staff either killed or turned. Reports suggested Varkas had gathered defectors, disgraced nobles, and exiled warlords, and now called himself the true blade of Zarenthia. He claimed the throne had been corrupted by human blood, and that he would restore it through fire. The Queen's court reacted with outrage, but behind closed doors, some eyes gleamed with something closer to hope. Rourke noticed it. So did Exalvora. And so, as the rebellion grew, so did the quiet alliance between the Queen and the man she had once intended to embarrass. Together, they prepared for war, but not just one of weapons. It was a war of ideas, of control, of the soul of a proud empire caught between its past and its future. The Queen began training again, not for show, but with purpose. She sparred with Rourke daily, learning his techniques, testing her own. Through bruises and sweat, through silence and clashing steel, something unspoken formed between them. Not romance, not yet, but trust. And trust, in the face of rebellion, was more dangerous than any weapon. One evening, after a long day of council meetings and intercepted transmissions, the Queen and Rourke found themselves alone in the strategy hall, surrounded by floating projections of enemy fleet movements. The flickering lights painted their faces in shades of blue and red. Zalvora broke the silence first. "You could leave, you know," she said. "You've earned honor among my people. The other systems would welcome you." Rourke didn't look away from the maps. "But would you?" The question hung in the air like a blade between them. She didn't answer immediately. Then, softly, she said, "No." It wasn't an admission of affection. It was something older, deeper, a recognition of necessity, of fate, of a bond that had started as punishment but now felt like prophecy. Outside the palace, the fires of rebellion were beginning to burn. But inside, for the first time, the Queen and her reluctant human consort stood side by side, not as enemies, and no longer as strangers, but as something new. And though they both knew the storm was coming, neither flinched. Because together, they were no longer symbols of broken pride or alien insult. They were warriors. And they were ready. The rebellion grew like a shadow stretching across the heart of the empire. In the cities, whispers of a true blade began to stir the streets. Soldiers once loyal to the Queen now questioned her decisions, some believing the throne had betrayed the ancient ways of Zarenthia. Varkas, once thought to be defeated, had become a symbol of resistance, a symbol of strength and purity. And as his forces swelled, so did the sense of doubt within the very court that Exalvora had worked so hard to build. Behind closed doors, some of her most trusted generals began to hesitate. The Queen's decision to bind herself to a human, a foreigner from Earth, had become a crack in the armor. But even in the face of growing division, Queen Exalvora did not flinch. She held her position, determined to fight for her throne and her empire, but she knew that the path ahead was more dangerous than ever. Varkas wasn't just a traitor. He was the manifestation of every fear her people had: fear of change, of weakness, of losing their place in the universe. And now, he was moving with an army that was more than just the disgraced. It was a force of angry civilians, mercenaries, and former warriors who believed in his cause. His numbers were growing rapidly, and soon he would be powerful enough to challenge the throne itself. In the midst of this chaos, Rourke and Exalvora sat at the heart of the palace's war room, reviewing strategy reports. The tension was thick between them, but it was a quiet kind of tension. They were no longer strangers, no longer at odds. There was no pretense. The rebellion was not just about Varkas, it was about the very heart of Zarenthia. The Queen had chosen to protect the Empire, but to protect it, she would need to confront the fear and pride of her own people. "The outer colonies are pulling back," Rourke said, his voice steady as he analyzed the projected movements of their fleet. "Varkas's message is spreading faster than we anticipated. You need to act soon. If you wait, you risk losing everything." Zalvora did not look away from the map. She had seen the same thing. The outer systems, where her empire's grip was weaker, were already beginning to fall into disarray. Fear of Varkas had reached their leaders. Her people were on the edge, unsure of their future. "If we attack now," she said slowly, "we risk losing our own people. The rebellion isn't just military, it's ideological. It's a war of hearts and minds. We need to show them that we still stand strong, that we haven't forgotten who we are." Rourke raised an eyebrow. "That's not just a battle of strength, it's a battle of trust, isn't it? They need to believe in you again, in your leadership." Zalvora looked at him, her golden eyes flickering with a mix of resolve and uncertainty. "It's not just about belief anymore. It's about survival." The weight of her words hung in the air. Rourke nodded, understanding more than she expected. "Then we must lead by example," he said, his voice low but firm. "Show them that you're not just the queen of a broken empire, you're a warrior, a leader. And together, we will give them something to believe in." For the first time since their bond had been formed, Exalvora allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. Her expression softened, and she gave a slight nod. "You've learned much in a short time, human," she said. "Perhaps more than I thought possible." Rourke shrugged. "I don't have the luxury of taking my time. Your empire has been built on strength, but strength doesn't just mean power. It means unity, trust. And right now, you're not just fighting for your throne, you're fighting for your people to trust you again. For them to believe that you are the right leader for Zarenthia." Zalvora turned away from him, gazing out at the darkening horizon beyond the palace walls. The twin moons of Zarenthia hung like glowing sentinels in the sky, their pale light casting long shadows over the city. The Queen's empire had been one of pride and dominance, built through countless wars, but now, in the face of internal collapse, she realized that what was truly at stake wasn't just her throne, it was the future of her people. And no amount of military might would win that war. Only trust could. She exhaled, her thoughts heavy with the burden of leadership. The rebellion was not something she had ever expected to face from within. But it was here and now. She would have to confront it on her own terms. The following days were filled with endless meetings and strategic decisions. The Queen had made up her mind. There would be no more hiding in the palace, no more avoiding the people. She would stand at the front lines of this battle, not as a monarch in her throne room, but as a leader among her people. And she would fight for them with every ounce of her strength. She called for a grand assembly and address to her people, an open declaration that the rebellion would not stand. The time had come to unite the empire, to show them that their queen was still the warrior they had always known. The hall was filled with whispers and gasps as she walked onto the stage, her golden armor gleaming under the bright lights. At her side was Rourke, standing tall and silent as ever. She met the eyes of the crowd, noble and common, warrior and civilian, and for a moment, she simply stood there, allowing the silence to hang in the air. It was a moment of power, of presence. And when she spoke, her voice was unwavering, strong, and filled with authority. Zarenthia is at a crossroads. Our strength has been tested, and we will be tested again. But I will not allow fear to divide us. We are an empire built on unity, on strength, and on honor. And together, we will show Varkas, and anyone else who dares threaten us, that we stand as one. This rebellion ends now. The crowd was silent for a moment. Then, slowly, they began to cheer at first quietly, then louder, until the entire hall rang with the sound of support. The queen had spoken, and she had spoken with the voice of a leader, not just a ruler. It was the beginning of something new. The rebellion would not be crushed by force alone, it would be crushed by unity, by showing the people that their queen was a warrior just as they were. The seeds of doubt had been planted, but now the queen was determined to uproot them. And with Rourke by her side, she was ready to fight for her empire, for her people, and for the future of Zarenthia. The war was upon them. The rebellion led by Varkas had become a juggernaut, gaining strength with every passing day, as if the entire empire had been infected by his message of purity and returned to the old ways. Zalvora's palace had become a fortress, not just of stone and steel, but of ideals that seemed to be crumbling at the edges. The queen knew that the fight ahead would not be won through military might alone. Her soldiers were well trained, her generals loyal, but the cracks ran deeper than she had imagined. As the rebellion spread, so did the seeds of doubt planted in the hearts of her people. It wasn't just the military that opposed her, now it was the very foundation of what Zarenthia had once been, a powerful empire built on fear and conquest. And now, it seemed, that same fear was turning against her. The final confrontation was set for the plains of Andros, a vast expanse where two armies would clash in the shadow of the planet's twin moons. Zalvora, ever the strategist, knew the stakes. This would be the moment that decided the future of her throne, her empire, and perhaps even her soul. The night before the battle, she stood alone on the balcony of her chamber, looking out over the vast horizon. The stars shone bright above her, but they felt distant, cold. Beside her, Rourke stood silently, his presence a steady comfort. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The weight of the coming battle hung in the air like a storm, waiting to break. Finally, Exilvora broke the silence. I did everything they asked of me. Everything the Empire demanded, she murmured, more to herself than to him. And now, it's all at risk. Because I made one mistake. Rourke's voice was steady, without judgment. You made no mistake, Zalvora. You chose to do what was right, not what was easy. Your strength isn't in your power alone. It's in your ability to adapt, to change when you need to. That's why you're the queen. She looked at him then, the words sinking in deeper than she expected. For so long, she had ruled with an iron fist, believing that strength alone was the key to power. But now, she realized that it was more than that, it was understanding. Understanding her people, their fears, their desires, and yes, their doubts. She was no longer the distant monarch who imposed her will without question. She was a leader who fought for their future, for their trust. The battle was approaching, and the armies of Varkas were assembling in the distance, preparing to march. The queen and her forces had a choice. They could meet the rebels head-on, hoping to crush them with sheer force, or they could outwit them, force them into a position where they could not win. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the plain, Zalvora made her decision. She would fight, but she would not fight in the way Varkas expected. She would not allow herself to be the symbol of the past, she would be the symbol of the future. The morning of the battle arrived, and with it, the thunder of war. The two armies stood face to face on the plains of Andros, the ground trembling beneath their feet. Varkas stood at the front of his army, a figure of defiance, his armor gleaming in the first light of dawn. His eyes locked onto Exilvora, and for a brief moment, she saw nothing but rage in his gaze. His anger was not just directed at her. It was the anger of a people who felt betrayed, the fury of an empire that feared losing its identity. Zalvora raised her sword, her voice carrying over the battlefield. Zarenthia will not fall. Not today. Not ever. The battle began, a clash of steel and fire. The armies collided with a deafening roar, the sound of weapons clashing echoing across the plain. Zalvora led the charge, her soldiers following her with fierce loyalty, their battle cries ringing in the air. But it wasn't the force of the army that gave her hope, it was the look in her people's eyes. They were not just fighting because they had to, they were fighting because they believed in her. And for the first time, Exalvora felt it. That bond she had spent so long trying to understand it was real. The battle raged for hours, both sides pushing and pulling, neither willing to give an inch. But as the sun climbed higher, the tide began to shift. Varkus's forces, though fierce, began to lose their ground. His men, though loyal, lacked the unity that Exalvora's soldiers had found. The queen's strategy built on trust, on the strength of her people, began to show its power. Rourke fought beside her, his calm presence steadying her every step. He had been right. This was a war of minds as much as it was of arms, and she had chosen to fight it with her heart. As the battle drew to its conclusion, Exalvora and Varkus faced each other on the battlefield. The two former warriors stood alone amidst the chaos, their swords drawn. Zalvora's armor was stained with blood, but her resolve had never been stronger. "You were wrong, Varkus," she said, her voice steady. "Zarenthia will change, but it will not die. It will evolve." Varkus sneered, his blade raised. "You've betrayed us all. You've turned your back on everything we stood for." "No," she said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I've turned my back on fear, and I've chosen something better, something stronger." The final clash was swift. Varkus's anger blinded him, and Exalvora's blade found its mark. He fell to the ground, defeated not just in body, but in spirit. The rebellion crumbled with him, the momentum lost, the people's resolve shattered. But it wasn't just his defeat that mattered, it was the victory of something more. The victory of a people united, not by fear, but by trust. As the last of Varkus's forces surrendered, Exalvora stood tall, her heart heavy with the cost of the battle, but proud of what she had achieved. The queen had faced her greatest trial, not just on the battlefield, but in herself. And she had won, not through strength alone, but through the power of unity, of understanding, of change. She had proved that even a broken empire could rise again, if its people chose to believe in a better future. Standing beside her, Rourke looked at her with quiet respect. The battle was over, but the true fight building the future of Zarenthia had only just begun.